Hi Year 12. So this is my annotation of Stafford afternoons. I'm going to keep it fairly informal and kind of as discursive as I can without you actually being there to discuss. And I'm not going to attempt to kind of tie up every loose end or answer every question, because Ellie made a fantastic suggestion that this could be the jumping off point for some discussion in the comment section where you can provide your own interpretations. So if I leave it slightly open-ended, that leaves a little bit of space for you to say what you think. So I'm going to split this into two sections, and we'll do up to stanza 3 in the first video, and then stanzas 4 to 6 in the second video. So as ever, we want to start with the title, and the title is Stafford Afternoons. So the word Stafford here ends up becoming an adjective, because it's describing the afternoons. Now, Stafford normally would be a noun, it's a place. But here it's telling us something about the afternoons, that these afternoons the protagonist talks about are specific to this place. Now, Stafford is countryside-y, so this is a place which is in the countryside and clearly specific to this person's memory. So it's a very specific memory that this person has. And they describe the afternoons. So together, Stafford afternoons is a noun phrase, so think about it all together. And the afternoons, to me, conjure up something about freedom. So you think about the afternoon after school when you're describing childhood, like Duffy is here. The afternoon is when you finish school, you've got free time to kind of do what you want. So to me, this conjures up ideas of freedom, escape maybe from the confines of school, and a certain amount of kind of space to be a little bit individual and do what you want to do. So there's a memory here of freedom and something very specific to this countryside, and therefore perhaps quite isolated place. There's also, I think, a little bit of a cliche. We're doing this one after Cliche Kid because they marry up quite well. And I think there's a cliche of childhood being a little bit restrictive and boring, particularly if you grew up in the countryside. That might be something that you guys connect with. So by specifically placing this memory in the countryside, I think Duffy is linking to that cliche of a kind of boring or quiet childhood, the kind that exists in the countryside. So we've managed to pull quite a lot out about that title, so it's isolating this memory in somewhere very specific. So I'll just read each stanza before we annotate. So it begins, only there the afternoons could suddenly pause, and when I looked up from lacing my shoe, a long road held no one. The gardens were empty, an ice cream van chimed and dwindled away. So I'm thinking about this opening phrase, only there, and this seems significant to me because I know, and I'm just going to put this at the top in caps, because we deal with the theme of memory in this poem, and we've said the memory is being located to a specific place. That's what this adverbial phrase does, only there, being specific to that place. So this adverbial phrase, again, it does the same job as the title. It locates this memory. The protagonist is saying that it's only in this specific part of the country, only in this very quiet, isolated bit of countryside, could time seem to stop, which is what the protagonist goes on to say. So only there, an adverbial phrase, again locating the memory somewhere very specific. And she says the afternoons could suddenly pause. So that's an interesting verb, because we know that time doesn't stop. So this is about the way that you remember something and how time, when you are thinking back on things, can seem a little bit flexible. So this verb is interesting because it suggests that time has stopped. and that could be for a couple of reasons. She goes on to describe a very, it sounds like quite a quiet afternoon where she's exploring and there's not much going on. So it could be that sense of, you know, when you're really bored and time just crawls by and you're looking at the clock and it's not seeming to go very fast. So it could be that time has stopped because of the kind of boredom of this quiet Stafford afternoon. Or it could be the protagonist telling us that when we look back on our childhood, time doesn't seem to behave in the same way that it does that when you're an adult. The childhoods of your, the memories of your childhoods as a young child are often much longer and more kind of filled with excitement than childhoods, summers as you get older, for example. So it could be that something to do with time is specific to looking back on your childhood, that you remember time differently. I'd be interested to know what you think of that. I wonder if I have a different perspective because I'm a bit older. So I think this is to do with remembering time differently. So only there, the afternoons could suddenly pause. And when I looked up from lacing my shoe, a long road held no one, the gardens were empty. The ice cream van chimed and dwindled away. So there's an image being built up through these three phrases here of isolation. So the long road held no one, the gardens were empty, and the sound of the ice cream van chimed and dwindled away. So I'm thinking about these words here: empty, no one, and we'll take dwindled away as well. So we've got a couple of things there, so I'm going to put this as a pattern. We've got a pattern of language here. Not all the same type of linguistic phrase, but that's okay. So we've got the adjective empty, oh, question mark, I'm going to come back and think about that. And dwindled away is a phrasal verb. I'm just going to have to check no one in this context. This is the beauty of me not preparing this in advance. You can see that I have to think about things as well. Feel free to fast forward this bit, obviously. Yeah, I think it's just going to be a pronoun here. So the pattern of the adjective with the pronoun and this phrasal verb all together build up this picture of isolation. That in this quiet afternoon, the protagonist is alone. Now, with that comes a couple of possible connotations, I think. So, a sense perhaps of foreboding and danger, because we know that a child alone, you know, it's something that you're cautioned about when you're younger. Make sure you don't wander off on your own, make sure you're not making yourself vulnerable. And this child is on their own, and it seems sudden. They look up and suddenly they're alone. So I think there's definitely a sense of there being some foreshadowing and foreboding of danger. But also perhaps linking back to this idea of the afternoon representing freedom. The child is finally on their own and they can do what they want. So I'm going to pick up that idea of freedom again. And I'm going to leave this open. I really want to know what you think about this image of the ice cream van. Why choose the ice cream van? Because it essentially describing the sound as disappearing is just adding to the idea that the person's alone, but they could have described any noise as disappearing. Why do you think it was an ice cream van that chimed and dwindled away? What might that have to do with themes of childhood, memory, potentially isolation as well? So the next stanza: on the motorway bridge I waved at windscreens, oddly hurt by the blurred waves back, the speed. So I let a horse in the noisy field sponge at my palm and invented in colour, a vivid lie for us both. So we start this stanza again a little bit like this one, with a phrase which isolates the memory somewhere specific. So this time, a prepositional phrase. On the motorway bridge. Now, that to me, this prepositional phrase is kind of suggesting two things. So a bridge often is a symbol about, linking between one place and another, which is obviously what a bridge literally does, but metaphorically kind of going from one place to another, or linking between two parts of a whole, for example. So to me, this bridge is the child going from perhaps safety into somewhere dangerous, somewhere isolated and alone. So prepositional phrase, I think, works as a metaphor for this kind of journey that she's on. So journey from safety to danger. You might interpret that metaphor in some other ways as well. But also, to me, a motorway bridge just kind of smacks of danger, fast-moving traffic beneath, and that being somewhere quite, potentially dangerous for a young child. So danger, and a sense of the poetic voice being vulnerable here. I've not been specific enough about poetic voice yet in this video, but here there's some vulnerability. And also the poetic voice feeling freedom, I think we can think about as well. Now, I'm going to leave this open. I want to know what you think about this bit. I waved at windscreens, oddly hurt by the blurred waves back. Why would the protagonist be hurt by the waves back? What do you think that's about? And then she's crossed the bridge and she gets to a field. So she lets the horse in a noisy field sponge at my palm and invented in colour a vivid lie for us both. Now I'm attracted to this phrase here, a vivid lie. Now, to me, this is the poetic voice thinking, okay, she's venturing quite far from home, clearly. She's crossed a motorway bridge, she's isolated and alone. It's dangerous, it's probably somewhere that she's not supposed to be. She wouldn't want people to know she's out there on her own. So it's the idea of constructing a lie about where she is, having to fib when she gets home about where she's been, and rather than it just being a lie that she concocts about herself, we see the kind of child's imagination when she decides to involve the horse in the lie that she's going to tell. So this noun phrase of a vivid lie to me talks about the imagination of a child. And how in that noun phrase the adjective vivid suggests that although it's a lie, it is full of colour and life to her. So she really believes, she will believe her own fiction that she creates. And like I say, I want to know what you think about this being hurt by the blurred waves. Also about this noisy field. Why is it described as noisy? Can we generate some significance there? And then final stanza of this video, in a cul-de-sac. A strange boy threw a stone. I crawled through a hedge into long grass at the edge of a small wood, lonely and thrilled. The green silence gulped once and swallowed me whole. So you'll see that there's a pattern in the structure of these stanzas. We begin with another prepositional phrase, in a cul-de-sac. So another prepositional phrase. And again, I see this as a metaphorical prepositional phrase, because if you think about a cul-de-sac, it's a road that you have to turn around to get back out of, so it's a dead end. And there's something metaphorical about a dead end, somewhere that you're not going to be able to progress on from. So this adventure that the child's on is something that she's going to have to turn around and return home, that she's not going to be able to move through this adventure, that she's going to have to return home in some way. So again, to me, this is metaphorical, and this is about something being a dead end, almost as if she is being warned. She gets to a cul-de-sac and she's being warned to go round and return home. But as we see from the end of the stanza, she doesn't heed that warning. So I'm just going to add that. There's a warning here to the poetic voice, but a warning that poetic voice doesn't heed. So that's met for metaphor. So she's in a cul-de-sac and a strange boy threw a stone, crawled through a hedge into long grass at the edge of a small wood, lonely and thrilled. So I'm going to zoom in on this juxtaposition of these two adjectives, lonely and thrilled. So we've talked about already the theme of loneliness and isolation, but that is tempered with the idea that that loneliness is thrilling to the poetic voice. They don't appear at this point frightened by the loneliness or the isolation, or indeed vulnerable yet. They just seem that this is the freedom that they have been desperate for. So it juxtaposes the loneliness with the thrill. So it's all about the poetic voice desiring the freedom and this adventure. The adventure from, to go back to the title, from this kind of stuffy, cliched, boring, quiet childhood, they're desperate for this sense of adventure, even if it puts them in a place where they are lonely and isolated. And then the stanza ends on this, I'm just going to pick out that idea of adventure for the poetic voice, desiring freedom. So we end on this metaphor, or personification to be specific, the green silence, gulped once and swallowed me whole. So the green silence is the wood. So we've got a metaphor of the wood, and then gulping and swallowing the child. So pick out two things here. I'm going to pick out these verbs, gulped and swallowed. So Duffy writes about this kind of thing in another one of her collections, which you might want to read. It's just really interesting, called The World's Wife. She writes a lot about nature and how nature is symbolic in The World's Wife. That's not a specific task, just something you can do for enrichment. And it's about what nature represents in terms of it being something dangerous. So the wood could be dangerous because it is somewhere that you could get lost. It's somewhere where there is cover. So, you know, somebody could be lurking there and could be going to do something nefarious. So the idea that the wood would gulp and swallow the child whole suggests the danger of the wood and nature. But it also takes on a personified form. So just add personification there. So this is, I'm going to attempt to explain what I mean here, but I want you to kind of add into the comments any elaboration or questioning about what I'm about to say. So nature here, the wood, means literal nature, like an actual wooded place, but also human nature. And as we go on in the poem, we'll see that the loneliness and the isolation of the child are challenged by a kind of predatory figure. And often when nature is described in poetry or literature, you could take it to mean the natural world or human nature. So if we take it to be the idea of human nature, then what we're saying is that this young child on an adventure and a bridge between, we said, kind of safety to danger, could be seen as a bridge between childhood and adulthood, and that therefore what we have to learn as we get older is that nature, human nature, is predatory. And not to make sweeping generalisations, but this is written from the perspective of a female, and often the predatory nature of humanity is represented as male. So there is something predatory and male that is being represented by this wood, and this child moving, going on this adventure on her own, is symbolic of going into adulthood and learning that you've got to protect yourself against people, and that people, human nature, is essentially predatory and can swallow you up, i.e. Kind of consume you, take you away from where you should be, damage you or endanger you in some way. So that's the kind of personification of nature being human nature. There's also the metaphor of the wood being green silence. And I'm going to leave that as our final question mark for this part of the video. So I want to know, why do you think there's green silence as the wood?